He was chosen by God and buried in disgrace. On a lonely mountainside, a king falls on his own sword, not killed by his enemies, but by the weight of who he became. Rewind. Once he was nothing, a farmer's son, taller than every man in Israel, humble enough to hide when they came to crown him king. But power has a way of finding the cracks in a man's heart. This is Saul, the first king of Israel, anointed by a prophet, tormented by jealousy, consumed by a throne he could not let go of. He had everything, until pride convinced him it wasn't enough. Tonight, we uncover how a chosen king became his own executioner, and how one decision, one refusal to bow, set his destruction in motion. This is the fall of Saul. He didn't want the throne. He didn't ask for the crown. But God chose him anyway, and it would cost him everything. Long before kings ruled this land, Israel was governed only by judges, men and women raised up by God in times of crisis and war. For decades, one man held that sacred role, Samuel, the last of Israel's judges, a prophet trusted by the people and beloved by God. But as Samuel grew old, the elders of Israel grew afraid. They looked at the surrounding nations, each ruled by a king, and they wanted the same. They came to Samuel with a demand: "Give us a king to judge us, like all the other nations." Their words struck him like a betrayal. Samuel took his grief to God in prayer, wounded by the people's rejection. But the answer he received was heavier than he expected. God told Samuel plainly, "It is not you they have rejected. It is me they have rejected as their king." Yet God allowed their request. Samuel warned the people plainly. A king would take their sons for war, their daughters for service, their fields, their flocks, their freedom. Still, the people refused to listen. "No," they said, "we will have a king over us, that we may be like all the other nations." Far from the tension of Israel's leaders, in the quiet hill country of Benjamin, an ordinary young man lived a life of humble simplicity. His name was Saul, tall, strong, and remarkably handsome, said to stand head and shoulders above every other man in Israel. One morning, his father's donkeys wandered off and disappeared into the hills. Saul was sent, along with a servant, to search and bring them home. For days, Saul and his servants searched the hill country, crossing valley after valley, but the donkeys were nowhere to be found. Exhausted and discouraged, Saul wanted to turn back home. But his servant had another idea, one that would change history forever. "There is a man of God in this town," the servant said. "Everything he says comes true. Perhaps he can tell us where to find the donkeys." Unknown to Saul, this town was preparing for a sacred feast, and the man they sought was none other than the prophet Samuel. At the town well, Saul asked a group of young women where he might find the seer. They pointed him toward the gates ahead. As Saul entered the town gate, he came face to face with Samuel himself, though Saul had no idea who stood before him. But Samuel already knew. The day before, God had whispered to him, "Tomorrow, a man from Benjamin will come. Anoint him, he is the one." If stories like this move you, stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments of destiny, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We bring these ancient stories to life week after week. And Saul's story is only just beginning. Turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Saul, still searching only for lost donkeys, had no idea that his entire life, and the future of an entire nation, was about to change forever. He came looking for what was lost. He would leave carrying a destiny he never imagined, and a burden that would one day break him. Samuel led Saul into the feast hall and seated him in the place of highest honor, a position reserved that night for someone very specific. A portion of meat, set aside earlier that day at Samuel's private instruction, was placed before Saul, a sign of favor Saul did not yet understand. Saul dined that evening as an honored guest among strangers, still unaware of the divine appointment quietly unfolding around him. Later that night, Samuel invited Saul to his rooftop, where the two spoke privately beneath the stars, judge and stranger, prophet and future king. Saul had no way of knowing that this quiet rooftop conversation was the final ordinary moment of his life before everything would change. At daybreak, Samuel walked with Saul to the edge of town, sending a servant ahead so the two men could speak alone. There, in the stillness of the open field, Samuel drew out a flask of oil, sacred, set apart, reserved only for anointing a king. Samuel poured the oil over Saul's head and kissed him, declaring solemnly, "Has not the Lord anointed you leader over his inheritance?" In that quiet, unremarkable field, far from any throne or crown, Israel's first king was anointed, chosen not by man, but by God. Saul stood frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just occurred. A farmer's son, suddenly marked for a throne he never sought. Samuel told Saul that on his journey home, he would encounter unmistakable signs, proof that God's hand truly rested upon him. Just as Samuel foretold, Saul met two men near his father's tomb, confirming that the lost donkeys had already been found safely at home. Further along the road, Saul encountered three men carrying offerings toward a sacred site, exactly as Samuel had described in advance. Finally, near the town gate, Saul met a procession of prophets descending from a sacred hill, playing music and prophesying together. Suddenly, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon Saul, and he began to prophesy alongside them, an ordinary man transformed before their eyes. Those who had known Saul his whole life stared in disbelief, whispering to one another, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" Sometime later, Samuel summoned all of Israel to Mizpah, where the nation would finally learn, through sacred lot, who their king would be. Tribe by tribe, clan by clan, the lot narrowed, until finally the tribe of Benjamin and the family of Kish was chosen. But when they called for Saul to step forward and be presented as king, he was nowhere to be found among the people. Overwhelmed by fear and humility, Saul had hidden himself among the baggage, unwilling to accept the destiny placed upon him. They searched and found him hiding among the supplies, and pulled him out before the entire assembly of Israel. When Saul stood among the people, he towered above every man in Israel, undeniable, unmistakable, exactly as God had chosen him to be. The people shouted with one voice, "Long live the king!" In that single moment, a humble farmer's son became the first king of Israel. While Israel celebrated its new king, a dark threat was already gathering beyond its borders, one that would test Saul before he ever sat on a throne. Nahash, king of the Ammonites, marched his army against Jabesh-Gilead, surrounding the town and demanding total surrender from its people. Nahash offered the people of Jabesh-Gilead a brutal condition, surrender, but only if every man agreed to lose his right eye in disgrace. Desperate and outmatched, the elders begged for 7 days, time to send word throughout Israel, hoping someone might come to their rescue. Messengers rode desperately from town to town across Israel, carrying news of the siege, and the people wept openly at what they heard. Word finally reached Gilboa, where Saul, Israel's newly anointed king, was still living simply, working his father's fields as he always had. When Saul heard of Jabesh-Gilead's suffering, something powerful stirred within him, the Spirit of God rushing upon him with righteous anger. In a shocking act, Saul slaughtered his own oxen, cutting the pieces apart and sending them throughout every territory of Israel as an urgent call to arms. His message was severe and unmistakable. Whoever refused to follow Saul and Samuel into battle would suffer the same fate as these oxen. Fear and unity spread like fire across the land. 330,000 men gathered at Bezek, Israel's first true national army. Saul organized this enormous force into 3 companies, preparing a decisive plan of attack under the cover of night. Saul sent word ahead to Jabesh-Gilead, "By the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will have deliverance." Hope quietly returned to the besieged town. The elders told Nahash they would surrender the next morning, concealing the truth that an entire army was already marching through the night. Through the darkness of night, Saul's 3 companies moved quietly into position, surrounding the unsuspecting Ammonite camp before the break of dawn. At the morning watch, Saul's army struck without warning, shattering the Ammonite camp from every direction in a single overwhelming assault. The Ammonite forces were completely overwhelmed, scattered so thoroughly that no 2 of them were left standing together by midday. By the time the sun grew hot, exactly as Saul had promised, Jabesh-Gilead was fully delivered, its people saved, its enemy destroyed. The people of Jabesh Gilead wept with relief and gratitude, embracing the soldiers who had crossed the land to save them from disgrace. In the aftermath of victory, some soldiers demanded punishment for those who had once mocked Saul and doubted his right to rule. But Saul refused to allow any bloodshed that day, declaring firmly, "No one will be put to death today, for today the Lord has rescued Israel." Samuel called the entire nation together at Gilgal, where Saul's kingship would be formally renewed and celebrated before all the tribes of Israel. Sacrifices of peace were offered before the Lord, and the entire nation of Israel rejoiced together, united, hopeful, and proud of their new king. For this shining moment, Saul stood at the height of his glory, beloved by his people, empowered by God, and utterly unaware of what still lay ahead. 2 years into his reign, Saul faced a far greater enemy than before, the Philistines, a powerful nation with iron weapons and disciplined armies. Jonathan, Saul's son, struck the first blow, attacking a Philistine outpost and igniting a conflict that would soon consume the entire land. In response, the Philistines gathered an army so vast it is described as being like the sand on the seashore, chariots, horsemen, and countless soldiers. Terrified by the size of the enemy force, many Israelites fled into caves, thickets, rocks, and pits, hiding wherever they could find shelter. Saul remained at Gilgal with what forces he had left, but with every passing hour, more of his frightened soldiers quietly deserted him. Samuel had instructed Saul earlier to wait 7 days at Gilgal, promising he would come to offer sacrifice and seek God's guidance before battle. But as the 7th day arrived and Samuel had still not come, Saul watched his army disintegrate before his very eyes. Fear gripped Saul as he considered the coming battle, a shrinking army, an approaching enemy, and no priest present to seek the Lord's favor. Unable to wait any longer, Saul made a fateful decision. He would offer the sacrifice himself, a role reserved only for God's appointed priests. Saul lit the fire and completed the burnt offering with his own hands, crossing a sacred boundary no king of Israel was permitted to cross. At that very moment, the instant the sacrifice was completed, Samuel finally appeared on the road, exactly as he had promised he would. Saul hurried out to greet Samuel, likely relieved that his ordeal was over. But Samuel's face carried none of that same relief. "What have you done?" Samuel asked, his voice heavy with disappointment as he surveyed the sacrifice Saul had no right to offer. Saul explained his reasoning. His army was scattering. The Philistines were closing in, and Samuel had not arrived within the appointed time. But Samuel's response was unflinching. Saul's excuses, however reasonable they seemed, could not undo the sacred command he had chosen to disobey. "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you." Samuel then spoke words that would echo across the rest of Saul's reign. "Your kingdom will not endure." The first crack in his crown had formed. Samuel revealed that God had already begun searching for a different kind of king, a man after his own heart, to replace Saul's line. Samuel departed from Gilgal, leaving Saul alone with the weight of his failure, a wound that no victory afterward could ever fully heal. When Saul finally counted his remaining forces, only 600 men remained with him, a fraction of the army he once commanded. Most of these remaining men had no swords or spears at all. The Philistines had ensured no blacksmith remained anywhere in the land of Israel. Outnumbered, under-equipped, and spiritually wounded by his own failure, Saul now faced the greatest military threat of his reign, with almost nothing left to fight with. Though he did not yet know it, Saul's greatest battles from this point forward would not be fought against the Philistines, but against himself. Between the Israelite and Philistine camps lay a narrow, treacherous pass at Michmash, guarded by steep cliffs on either side. Without informing his father, Jonathan turned to his armor-bearer and proposed a daring plan to cross into enemy territory, just the two of them. "Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving," Jonathan said, "whether by many or by few." His faith stood in stark contrast to his father's fear. The two men climbed the treacherous cliffs on their hands and feet, approaching the Philistine garrison completely unnoticed in the early morning light. The Philistines spotted them and mockingly called out, inviting them up the cliff to teach them a lesson. unaware this was exactly Jonathan's plan. Jonathan and his armor-bearer struck without warning, killing about 20 men within a small stretch of ground, and the entire outpost fell into panic. A supernatural terror gripped the Philistine army, and the ground itself seemed to tremble as confusion spread rapidly throughout their entire camp. From a distance, Saul's watchmen noticed the strange chaos spreading through the enemy camp. Though no one understood yet what had caused it, Saul ordered a quick count of his men and discovered that his own son Jonathan, along with his armor-bearer, were nowhere to be found. Realizing the chaos was Jonathan's doing, Saul quickly gathered his remaining 600 men and rushed toward the growing confusion below. In their terror and confusion, Philistine soldiers began striking one another blindly, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the panic. Even Israelites who had previously deserted or hidden in fear now emerged from the hills, rejoining Saul's forces as the tide of battle turned. Determined to press his advantage fully, Saul made a rash and sweeping vow before his exhausted army, desperate to guarantee complete victory. "Cursed is anyone who eats food before evening comes," Saul declared, "before I have avenged myself on my enemies." No one dared to disobey. As the exhausted army pushed deeper into the forest, wild honey dripped freely from the trees. Yet not one soldier dared to taste it. Jonathan, who had not heard his father's oath, dipped the tip of his staff into a honeycomb and ate, his eyes brightening instantly with renewed strength. A nearby soldier warned Jonathan of his father's oath, and Jonathan's face darkened with concern at the burden his father had placed on the army. "My father has brought trouble to the land," Jonathan said quietly, recognizing that the vow had only weakened the army at its moment of victory. When evening finally came, the starving soldiers rushed upon captured animals so desperately that they ate meat still containing blood, violating sacred law. Saul quickly intervened, ordering a large stone rolled forward so the animals could be properly slaughtered, correcting the army's unintended sin. When Saul sought God's guidance for further pursuit that night, only silence answered him, a troubling sign that something was deeply wrong. Through sacred lots, Saul discovered the troubling truth. His own son Jonathan had unknowingly broken the very curse Saul himself had spoken. Though Saul was prepared to enforce his rash vow even against his own son, the soldiers intervened boldly, refusing to let Jonathan die for his father's careless words. Sometime later, Samuel came to Saul once more, carrying a command from God that would test the very depths of Saul's obedience. "Now go and attack the Amalekites," Samuel declared, "and totally destroy everything they have. Spare no one, man, woman, child, or animal." This judgment traced back generations to when the Amalekites viciously attacked Israel's exhausted stragglers during their long journey through the wilderness. Saul assembled a massive force, 200,000 soldiers, and marched south toward the territory of the Amalekites to carry out God's judgment. Before the attack, Saul warned the Kenite, a peaceful people living among the Amalekites, to withdraw safely, sparing them from the coming judgment. Saul's army swept through Amalekite territory with overwhelming force, striking from Havilah all the way to the border of Egypt. In the heat of victory, Saul's men captured King Agag of the Amalekites alive, a direct contradiction to the command God had given. Saul and his soldiers spared the best of the sheep and cattle, the fattened calves and lambs, keeping everything that seemed valuable or useful. Only what was despised and worthless was destroyed, while everything of true value was preserved, a direct violation of God's explicit command. To Saul and his men, this appeared to be a complete and glorious victory, unaware that their partial obedience had already provoked God's grief. That same night, word came to Samuel from God, and the prophet was so deeply grieved that he cried out to the Lord until dawn. "I regret that I made Saul king," God told Samuel, "for he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." Unaware of the judgment already forming against him, Saul traveled to Carmel and set up a monument to celebrate his own victory. Samuel rose early the next morning and set out to confront Saul directly, carrying the full weight of God's rejection with him. When Saul saw Samuel approaching, he greeted him with pride, declaring boldly, "I have carried out the Lord's instructions completely." But Samuel simply replied, Then what is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? Saul quickly explained that the soldiers had spared the best animals only to sacrifice them to God, a justification that rang hollow before the prophet. "Stop," Samuel said sharply. "Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." Saul fell silent before the prophet's words. Samuel reminded Saul of how small he once considered himself, and how God had elevated him despite his humble beginnings, trusting him with a kingdom. Then Samuel spoke the words that would define Saul's legacy forever. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord," Samuel declared, "he has rejected you as king." The sentence had finally been spoken aloud. Saul grabbed desperately at the hem of Samuel's robe as the prophet turned to leave, and the robe tore in his trembling hands. "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today," Samuel said, "and has given it to one of your neighbors, better than you." Saul remained kneeling in the dust long after Samuel's words had faded, the torn robe in his hand a permanent symbol of all he had lost. Saul begged Samuel to return with him publicly before the people, desperate to preserve at least the appearance of honor before his own soldiers. Though the judgment could not be undone, Samuel agreed to walk back with Saul, allowing him to worship before the people one final time. Samuel then ordered King Agag brought before him, the enemy King Saul had spared in direct defiance of God's command. Agag approached cautiously, perhaps believing his life might yet be spared. But Samuel's face carried the full weight of unfinished justice. "As your sword has made women childless," Samuel declared, "so will your mother be childless among women." The judgment Saul refused to complete was finally carried out. With justice finally fulfilled, Samuel departed for his home in Ramah, while Saul returned to his own house in Gibeah, the two men parting for what would be the last time as king and prophet. Samuel mourned deeply for Saul for the rest of his days, grieving over the king he had once anointed with such hope and promise. Eventually, God spoke to Samuel directly. "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel?" God instructed Samuel to fill his horn with oil and travel to Bethlehem, for he had already chosen the next king from among Jesse's sons. Fearful that Saul might discover his true purpose and react violently, Samuel traveled to Bethlehem under the guise of offering a sacrifice. The elders of Bethlehem trembled at Samuel's unexpected arrival, unsure whether the prophet's visit brought blessing or judgment upon their town. Jesse presented his sons one by one, beginning with Eliab, tall, strong, and impressive, appearing every bit like a king should look. But God spoke quietly to Samuel. "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." One by one, 7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, yet each time, God gave no confirmation. None of them were the chosen one. Confused, Samuel asked Jesse directly, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse hesitated, admitting one more remained, the youngest, tending sheep in the fields. Far from the gathering in town, unaware of what awaited him, David, the youngest of Jesse's sons, remained quietly watching over his father's flock. Samuel insisted David be brought immediately, declaring firmly, "We will not sit down until he arrives." The ceremony would not continue without him. When David finally arrived, he appeared before them, young, ruddy, with striking eyes and a countenance unlike any of his brothers before him. This time, God spoke clearly to Samuel, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." The search that began in fear now ended in quiet certainty. In the presence of his brothers, Samuel anointed David with oil, and from that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. Meanwhile, far away in Gibeah, Saul remained completely unaware that the very throne he sat upon had already been promised to another. Soon after, a dark and troubling spirit began to torment Saul, the first shadow of a darkness that would follow him for the rest of his life. Saul's servants grew increasingly alarmed, watching their king descend into fits of anguish that no physician or remedy seemed able to relieve. The servants suggested that music might soothe the king's troubled spirit, and one attendant recommended a young shepherd skilled with the harp. That shepherd was David, described not only as skilled in music, but as a brave warrior, wise in speech, and blessed with the Lord's favor. Saul sent word to Jesse, requesting that his son David be brought to the palace to serve directly before the king. David arrived at Saul's court carrying simple gifts from his father, entering the palace not as a threat, but as a humble servant. When David played, something remarkable happened. The tormenting spirit lifted from Saul, and the king finally found relief and comfort. Saul grew genuinely fond of David, appointing him as one of his personal armor-bearers and requesting his presence whenever the torment returned. Sometime later, war broke out once again with the Philistines, both armies gathering on opposite hillsides above the valley of Elah. From the Philistine ranks emerged a champion named Goliath, a giant of a man, standing over 9 feet tall, clad in heavy bronze armor. Goliath challenged Israel to send a single champion to face him in personal combat, and every soldier in Saul's army trembled with fear. David, sent by his father to deliver food to his older brothers serving in the army, witnessed the terror gripping Israel's entire camp. Unlike the soldiers around him, David felt only righteous indignation, asking boldly why anyone would allow this pagan giant to defy the armies of the living God. Brought before Saul, David volunteered to face Goliath himself, recounting how he had already killed a lion and a bear while protecting his father's flock. Saul offered David his own royal armor, but the heavy bronze proved cumbersome and unfamiliar, and David chose instead to face the giant as himself. Armed only with his shepherd's staff, a sling, and 5 smooth stones gathered from a nearby stream, David walked forward to meet the giant. Goliath mocked the young shepherd boy approaching him, cursing David by his gods and promising to feed his flesh to birds and wild beasts. David answered without fear, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." David ran quickly toward the battle line, slung a single stone, and struck Goliath directly in the forehead, the giant collapsing instantly to the ground. With their champion fallen, the entire Philistine army turned and fled in terror, pursued relentlessly by the emboldened soldiers of Israel. As Saul's army returned triumphant, women poured out from every town, singing and dancing to celebrate the extraordinary victory over the Philistines. But their song carried words that struck Saul deeply. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Something shifted in the king's heart. From that day forward, Saul regarded David with deep suspicion, his mind consumed by a single corrosive thought: what more can he get but the kingdom? The very music that once soothed Saul's torment now seemed to mock him, as jealousy quietly took root where gratitude once lived. The very next day, the tormenting spirit returned upon Saul, and David once again played his harp, unaware of the darkness building within the king. Without warning, Saul hurled his spear directly at David, determined to pin him to the wall, but David narrowly escaped, twice unharmed. Saul grew afraid of David, recognizing that the Lord had departed from him and now rested powerfully upon the young man he once loved. Saul removed David from his presence, placing him in command of soldiers, secretly hoping the Philistines might succeed in killing him on the battlefield. But David succeeded in every mission given to him, and his popularity among the people and soldiers only continued to grow with each victory. Saul offered David his daughter Michal in marriage, secretly hoping the dangerous dowry he demanded would finally lead to David's death in battle. Once again, David succeeded where Saul hoped he would fail, and Saul realized with growing dread that God's hand remained firmly upon his rival. Saul's jealousy finally became open hostility, as he commanded his own son Jonathan and his servants to kill David whenever the opportunity arose. Jonathan, torn between loyalty to his father and love for his closest friend, warned David secretly and pleaded with Saul on his behalf. Moved by Jonathan's words, Saul swore an oath that David would not be killed, a promise that would not last long against his growing torment. But the peace was short-lived. Once again the tormenting spirit overtook Saul, and once again he hurled his spear at David without warning. David fled to his own house, but Saul's men surrounded it that very night, and Michal helped her husband escape through a window into darkness. David fled to Samuel in Ramah, and even when Saul sent soldiers to capture him there, they too fell under the Spirit's power and began to prophesy. In a quiet field outside Gibeah, Jonathan confirmed through a secret signal that his father's intent to kill David was now beyond question. The two friends wept together before parting, renewing their covenant of loyalty, a bond that would endure even through Saul's growing madness. David became a fugitive, wandering from cave to cave and stronghold to stronghold, pursued relentlessly across the wilderness of Judah by Saul's forces. In one remarkable moment, Saul entered a cave where David and his men were secretly hiding, completely unaware of how close he stood to death. David quietly cut off a corner of Saul's robe rather than take his life, and his conscience immediately troubled him for even that small act. David called out to Saul, showing him the torn piece of robe as proof that he held no intention of harming the king who hunted him. Saul wept and admitted that David was more righteous than himself, acknowledging that David could have killed him but chose mercy instead. Years later, as the Philistines gathered again for war, Saul looked upon their army and was overcome with a fear unlike anything he had felt before. Desperate for guidance that God no longer offered him, Saul disguised himself and sought out a medium at Endor, defying the very laws he once enforced. The spirit of Samuel rose before Saul and delivered his final crushing words, "Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me." Saul's fate was now sealed. At the break of dawn on Mount Gilboa, the armies of Israel and Philistia gathered once more, both sides sensing this battle would be decisive. Saul rose that morning already broken, carrying the crushing weight of the prophecy spoken over him the night before at Endor. Beside Saul stood his son Jonathan, along with his brothers Abinadab and Malchishua, all preparing to fight what many already feared was a losing battle. The Philistines attacked with overwhelming force, archers loosing arrows in devastating volleys across the battlefield. Israel's forces began to break and scatter almost immediately, unable to withstand the ferocity and discipline of the advancing Philistine army. Jonathan fought bravely to the very end, but he and his brothers were struck down together on the mountainside, their bodies falling among the slain. News of Jonathan's death had not yet reached Saul, who continued fighting desperately amid the collapsing ranks of his shattered army. The battle pressed hard against Saul himself, and Philistine archers found their mark, wounding the king critically as his defenses crumbled around him. Gravely wounded, Saul turned to his armor-bearer and begged him to finish what the arrows had started, desperate to avoid capture and humiliation. "Draw your sword and run me through," Saul pleaded, "so these uncircumcised men will not abuse and kill me." But his armor-bearer could not obey. Left with no other choice, Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. The king who once stood taller than all Israel, now brought to his lowest moment. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell upon his own sword, unwilling to survive the death of the king he had served. That day, Saul died alongside his 3 sons and his armor-bearer, along with countless soldiers of Israel who had followed him into this final battle. The next day, Philistine soldiers returning to strip the dead discovered Saul's body among the fallen, along with his sons lying nearby. In a final act of humiliation, the Philistines cut off Saul's head, stripped his armor, and sent messengers throughout their land to proclaim the news. Saul's armor was placed in the temple of their gods, and his body was fastened to the walls of Beth-shan for all to see. When the valiant men of Jabesh-Gilead heard what had been done to Saul, they remembered the king who once saved their city from disgrace. Traveling through the night, these brave men retrieved the bodies of Saul and his sons, carrying them back home to give their fallen king a proper burial. The people of Jabesh-Gilead burned the bodies respectfully, buried their bones beneath a tamarisk tree, and fasted for 7 days and mourning. Far away, a messenger arrived at David's camp, tearing his clothes in mourning, bringing word of the devastating deaths of Saul and Jonathan. Rather than relief, David felt only profound grief, weeping and mourning deeply for the king who had once tried relentlessly to end his life. David composed a lament called the Song of the Bow, declaring how the mighty have fallen, honoring both Saul and Jonathan with profound sorrow. With Saul's death, Israel's first kingdom came to its tragic end, and the throne, long promised to another, finally passed to David. Saul's story begins not with ambition, but with humility. He was a farmer's son searching for lost donkeys, a man so unassuming that when the moment came to be crowned before all of Israel, he hid among the baggage rather than step into the light. There was no hunger for power in him at the start, only fear, uncertainty, and a quiet reluctance to accept a destiny he never sought. God saw something in that humility worth building a kingdom upon, and for a time it was enough. Saul rallied a fractured nation, delivered Jabesh-Gilead from disgrace, and stood as a symbol of what Israel could become under God's chosen leadership. But somewhere between the battlefield victories and the weight of the crown, something in Saul began to shift. It did not happen all at once. It happened in small moments, a sacrifice offered out of impatience rather than faith, a rash vow spoken to secure glory rather than trust God's timing, a command only partially obeyed because certain spoils seemed too valuable to destroy. Each compromise seemed reasonable in the moment. Each justification felt, to Saul, like wisdom rather than disobedience. This is perhaps the most sobering truth of his story. Saul's downfall was not born from a single catastrophic sin, but from a slow erosion of trust, a gradual choice, repeated again and again, to rely on his own judgment over God's clear instruction. Samuel's words to him at Gilboa remain one of the most piercing lines in all of Scripture. To obey is better than sacrifice. Saul believed he was honoring God by preserving the best of the plunder for sacrifice, but in reality, he was rewriting obedience on his own terms. This is the quiet danger of pride. It rarely announces itself as rebellion. It disguises itself as reasonable judgment, as practical wisdom, as a slight adjustment to what God actually required. Saul was never a man who set out to defy God outright. He was a man who slowly convinced himself that his own reasoning was close enough to obedience to count. And then came David, not as Saul's enemy, but as his soothing companion, his armor-bearer, his son-in-law, the very man who calmed his tormented spirit with music. This is what makes Saul's tragedy so devastating. The one who threatened his throne was not a foreign invader or a scheming rival, but a loyal, humble young man who never once raised a hand against him. David spared Saul's life not once, but twice, when he had every opportunity and justification to end it. Saul's real enemy was never David. It was the jealousy quietly growing inside his own heart, magnified by fear, magnified by pride, until it consumed every rational thought he once had. By the time Saul stood on Mount Gilboa, staring down an overwhelming Philistine army, he was already a broken man, abandoned by the prophet who once anointed him, rejected by the God he once served faithfully, haunted by the knowledge that the kingdom he clung to had already been promised to another. His final act, seeking guidance from a medium at Endor, reveals just how far he had fallen from the humble young man hiding among the baggage. The same man who once trembled at the thought of being king now defied God's own law in a desperate, final attempt to control a fate he could no longer escape. Saul's death on the battlefield was not merely a military defeat. It was the final, tragic expression of a life spent choosing self-preservation over surrender, pride over humility, control over trust. He fell not by an enemy's sword, but by his own hand, a haunting symbol of a man ultimately undone by the very throne he once refused to accept. Yet Saul's story is not simply a cautionary tale of failure. It is a mirror. Few of us will ever wear a crown, lead an army, or face a giant on an open battlefield. But all of us face the same quiet temptations that slowly unraveled Saul. The temptation to justify disobedience as practical wisdom, to let jealousy fester into resentment, to trust our own judgment over patient obedience, to cling tightly to positions, titles, or reputations we were never meant to hold onto so desperately. Perhaps this is why Saul's story endures across thousands of years, not because he was uniquely evil, but because he was profoundly human. He began with humility and ended in ruin, not through one dramatic decision, but through 1,000 small choices to trust himself just a little more than he trusted God. His story stands as a solemn warning and a piercing reflection. The throne we refuse to surrender, the pride we refuse to release, will eventually become the very thing that destroys us. In the end, Saul's tragedy teaches us that greatness is not measured by the height of one's crown, but by the humility with which it is carried, and that even those chosen and anointed by God are not immune to the quiet, corrosive power of unyielding pride.